Hello, this is a talk all about science communication, public engagement of science. It's something which I drifted into back in 1997. I had no idea what I was getting myself into. By the end of this talk, you can rest assured there will be plenty of encouragements to do science communication. And I want to look at it in a particular way by beginning anyway, by having a look at some of my favourite stereotypes of science and scientists. En route, I'm going to tell you about a taxi journey I had, which had quite an impact on me. It left me feeling paranoid for a few days, but I think I came out in a slightly better place. Anyway, all that will be revealed shortly. I had been sent by my boss at the BBC to do some talent hunting, to see if I could spot potential presenters for science programmes. And the truth was my base was in Bristol, and we were going to try and steal some programming from the other science units in London, or the only science units which were based in London at that time. And we were a features department, and we were gonna try our hand and seeing if we could encroach a little bit on their territory. This was in the days when the BBC was setting departments against each other in the interests of competition. Anyway, I'm not going to go down that road. I went to the Science Museum, and actually this was in about 1996, something like that, not long before I quit the BBC. And it was a scientific literacy conference. And I remember going to an event which was encouraging us to be much more engaging and so on in science communication. And the event was so incredibly mind-numbingly boring that it would have been a relief to have gnawed on your own foot, basically, because it was such a difficult experience. And I caught the eye of someone else who was there, who could see my anguish, and also we could both somehow detect the irony of the thing. And we started to laugh, and it was one of those embarrassing giggles, you know, as an adult, just trying to cover your face so that people wouldn't see that you were actually trying not to burst into outright laughter. The person turned out to be a professor at Imperial College, and we went and had a drink in the break, just a bit of a chat. And he invited me to start teaching on a course that he was setting up, one of the very first courses in the UK, encouraging scientists to do public engagement. It was a course mostly for postdocs, and I started teaching media science on that course, and eventually ran the second year of that course, and did so happily for several years. Anyway, this is not really supposed to be so much about my own history, but to say that in that time I've learned a lot about public engagement and why it's important. And I have to tell you, I think it's never been more important than it is right now. But I'll come to that shortly. One of the things I love to do is to explore stereotypes of scientists. Stereotypes in fiction. I'm going to call these artful fictions, and there are quite a few of them. If you watch The Big Bang Theory, you'll be entertained by it, but you're also watching, the kind of geeky stereotype. And you might well go, well, I know people like that, or I have colleagues like that. And the stereotyping is in and of itself quite funny. I'm guessing that most people are able to separate fact from fiction, but nevertheless, I guess even those of us who think we're pretty savvy are affected by stereotypes of various kinds. It's just that in our world, we know that world so much better. Our knowledge is so much richer that we don't get dragged off down the road, too far down the road of complete fantasy. So the first artful fiction that I want to highlight is probably the first work, true work of science fiction. It was written in 1818 by a 21-year-old woman, Mary Shelley. And she went with her husband, the poet Percy Shelley, to stay in a chalet in Lake Geneva for a holiday with their friend Lord Byron and his lover at the time, Claire Clairmont. And the idea was they were going to have a great holiday, but as is the wont of Lake Geneva, the storms blew up and the rain came in, the storm rolled around the hillsides, and it was impossible to do anything. So they hatched a plan to write, and they challenged each other to write the scariest story that they could. Now, I have to put my glasses on, which may glint a bit in the lights, but I want to read you something. It may well be that the lake itself, the surrounding hillsides, the rolling storm and everything was ominous enough and would have had an impact on anybody. But Mary Shelley was known to suffer from what she called waking dreams, hallucinations, we would say. And she had a hallucination as she'd been thinking hard about a story that she wanted to create. And this just came to her. This is what she saw. I saw the pale student of unhallowed arts kneeling beside the thing he had put together. In other words, this man was a scientist. I saw the hideous phantasm of a man stretched out, and then, on the working of some powerful engine, show signs of life, and stir with an uneasy, half-vital motion. Frightful must it be, for supremely frightful would be the effect of any human endeavour to mock the stupendous mechanism of the creator of the world. Wow, powerful stuff. And that was the start of the Frankenstein myth. And people say that it's the first science fiction story, the first proper science fiction story, because even though it isn't true, even though the science isn't true, it was the first time the idea of science had been evoked to do something so extraordinary. So in ancient times, pick a story like Metamorphosis, which was by the Roman poet Ovid, who'd been banished to the Black Sea for some alleged misdeed. And he told a story about a man who carved a beautiful ebony statue, a statue of a woman, and it was so beautiful that it came to life. But it came to life, of course, because the gods had bestowed life upon it. And there are plenty of stories like that where the gods get involved, supernatural powers get involved. But Frankenstein, or the new Prometheus, as Mary Shelley called it, Frankenstein is about science. It's about human activity, human wit and cunning has brought this thing about. And even though we know the science isn't true, the idea of it really does make it genuine science fiction for the first time. One of the great themes of the Frankenstein story is that Victor Frankenstein, representing science, is playing God. He's gone into God's territory and he's doing what hitherto only God could do, extending human life or giving life. This is both exhilarating and terrifying. It's exhilarating because human beings, through their wit and their cleverness, their science, have taken their destiny back to themselves. And it's terrifying because it has the hint of, or more than a hint, of blasphemy about it. Maybe human beings are doing things that they ought not to do. It provokes a whole debate about what it means to be a mature humanity. The upside of the Victor Frankenstein stereotype of the scientist is that he's bold and he's brave and he's clever. And through hard work, he achieves the seemingly impossible, providing marvellous benefits. Now, the story goes off in very strange and distressing directions, but it certainly begins with a tremendous promise of hope. The downside of the Victor Frankenstein stereotype as a scientist is that he is arrogant. He is the furthest thing from a community person. He alone determines what's right and what's wrong, and he is completely unaccountable. So in countering the stereotype, scientists need to say, point out, share that science is a community project. Science is funded through community-raised taxes, and that science and research ultimately belongs to people, to human beings, and that this is something that we do. If scientists are at the coalface, they are at the coalface on behalf of human beings, finding stuff out that we didn't know before. The reason the villagers went and hammered on the doors of Frankenstein's laboratory and demanded with pitchforks and things to know what was going on was because the door was closed and because they were afraid. And science communication is about opening those doors and explaining in terms that are relevant to the people asking those questions what the science is all about. The second artful fiction that allows me to talk about a stereotype of scientists is, for me, an almost perfect science fiction film. It's Back to the Future. It fits together beautifully like a jigsaw. It features the young Marty McFly, played by Michael J. Fox, who goes back in time from, I believe, 1985 to 1955 in a DeLorean car fitted with a time machine built by our stereotype, Dr. Emmett Brown. Emmett Brown is wild-haired and wild-eyed and very eccentric. He's a kind of a hobbyist, really. I mean, he's a professional scientist, but he kind of does whatever he likes. He's absent-minded. He invents things like a mind-reading machine, which doesn't actually work. And of course, having fallen and bashed his head, he gets an idea for a time machine and he fits it to a DeLorean car, and hey presto, an icon is born. I'm told by my son that the original idea for the vehicle that the time traveller would go in was a fridge, but it was thought that the fridge would be dangerous for children who would try and copy it by getting into a fridge, and so they opted for the DeLorean, and we're all very glad that they did. The upside of the Emmett Brown Boffins stereotype is his inventiveness and his playfulness. Playfulness being such an important part of the scientific temperament, to find things fascinating, to be endlessly inquisitive and curious. These are very attractive qualities. The downside of the Boffin stereotype is the idea that if you throw enough resources at somebody, then they can do anything. It's not hard to detect the tendency in some politicians that if we have problems, it's okay because science will sort it out. You just throw resources at them and they'll figure it out for you. So if climate change becomes too uncomfortable, don't worry because scientists will sort it out. And if we don't act quickly enough to deal with a virus, don't worry because science will come up with a vaccine and sort it out for us. There's a kind of irony there, of course, because those same politicians don't listen to good advice from scientists in the first place. They are happy to instruct, but less happy to take advice. My third artful fiction that allows me to talk about a stereotype is a film that was made in 1964 by Stanley Kubrick. If you've never seen Dr. Strangelove, then don't see it if you're feeling particularly down. But if it's a nice wet Sunday afternoon and you fancy watching a classic dark comedy, then Dr. Strangelove could be for you. Dr. Strangelove is a vehicle for Peter Sellers to really show off. He plays three of the characters in the film. One of them is called Group Captain Lionel Mandrake, and he finds himself face to face with a rogue general called Jack D. Ripper, who has launched a nuclear missile against Russia, provoking a nuclear war. Of course, the President of the United States is not very happy about this, and they all retire to the bunker deep below the Pentagon, where enter Dr. Strangelove, another one of Sellers' characters. Dr. Strangelove is indeed a very strange and sinister character indeed. As I say, he's played by Peter Sellers. He's advisor to the president, who's also played by Peter Sellers, and he appears almost out of the blue down in the meeting underneath the Pentagon to discuss the crisis. And he announces the doomsday weapon. What it means is that if a nuclear strike happens, then automatically, without reference to human beings, nuclear missiles will be fired off automatically. And the idea was that this doomsday machine was a kind of deterrent, that nobody would ever think of firing a missile at the United States because of the existence of the doomsday machine. But of course, it's all gone terribly wrong. The film itself came about because Stanley Kubrick was genuinely very concerned about the safety of nuclear weapons. You know, who got to have their finger on the button. And although the administration said that everything was perfectly okay, it was the Eisenhower administration, in fact, who had delegated control of nuclear weapons to a variety of officers. And when the Kennedy administration came in, they were deeply shocked to discover how far this had gone and how many people were able arbitrarily to actually start a nuclear war. So they reined it all in again. It's very difficult to find in the character of Dr. Strangelove this stereotype of an evil scientist, something to be positive about. I can, though, tell you something positive about the film before we move on. It was listed as one of America's top 3 comedies by the Film Institute. And in 1989, the United States Library of Congress included Dr. Strangelove as one of the first 25 films selected for preservation in the National Film Registry for being culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant. And that's interesting because the film reflected its times, and it actually reflected real, genuine concerns. The scientific community, of course, in communicating what science is all about and how science is done, is able to speak against the evil stereotype. Science cannot gloss over the fact that some scientists have behaved badly, and there have been movements in science, think for example of the eugenics movement and people like Galton and so on, of which it's not possible to be very proud. But science has a tremendous history of being cooperative and of being highly ethical and of trying to reach consensuses and having some very painful debates to get to a place which is good for humankind. And so that's something which the scientific community can be very proud of. So I said I'd tell you about a taxi journey that made me feel a little bit paranoid. Well, it starts with a really pleasant experience that every now and again I fly out to Geneva, in Switzerland. And when I'm there, I take the tram, which runs to the end of its line, and it stops at a very interesting collection of buildings, which is the home of the Large Hadron Collider at CERN. And I get to run workshops for physicists and engineers in public engagement skills. Anyway, one of the things that they do is they have a Friday meeting there. This is essentially the communications team will arrange Friday meetings, and the meetings, all kinds of people come to them, and they range from very, very technical subjects to sort of more philosophical ones. And one day they asked me if I would speak at the meeting, the lunchtime meeting, which I did. And in the course of it, some people from the communications press office were telling us all about the kinds of calls that they get on a weekly basis. People phone up and they say things like, what are the aliens planning? We know that you're in touch with them, and we know that they talk to you. So what do they want, and what are they going to do? Sometimes people phone up and are genuinely anxious about the experiments, and they say you really must stop the experiments because they will create a black hole and the Earth will be swallowed up. And dealing with those kinds of things must be quite difficult. Anyway, we had a conversation around all of this kind of thing and about conspiracy theories that people have, and the accusations that are made to organizations like CERN by conspiracy theorists. And I eventually travelled back home, got in a taxi to go to my house, and the taxi driver, as they do, started chatting to me. And out of the blue, he started to tell me that we had never actually been to the moon. That is, human beings had never landed on the moon. And I said, why do you think that? And he said, well, and he gave me all the evidence that he could think of, 2 or 3 bits of evidence that he thought were important. And I said, but why do you think this against, all the opinion of scientists and the fact that we've seen this and newsreels and the Russians have monitored it and so on? He said, well, there's a very, very good YouTube video about it. And I have to say, after my conversation with the people at CERN, I began to feel rather anxious that basically the whole world was going mad and that we were surrounded by people that believed alternative truths. Fortunately, we have surveys that tell us a slightly more optimistic picture about the relationship of the public at large and scientists. So strange stories notwithstanding, and the influence of albeit entertaining stereotypes aside, we found, for example, that the Wellcome Global Monitor asked 140,000 people in more than 140 countries how they feel about health care and science, and whether or not they trust scientists in the area of healthcare. And a full 75% gave a very solid approval to the role of science as far as it went for healthcare. So when it comes to something like climate change, which of course is more controversial or is used more controversially by politicians, what do people make of it then? Well, there's a Pew survey which came out last year, which surveyed 26 countries. And they found that a majority of people supported what scientists were saying, that climate change is the most serious threat to the world and therefore to their country. The median figure was 68%. Greece was up at about 90%, and Israel, I think, was down around about 38%, something like that. My own country, the UK, was 62%. So still an awful lot of people to convince about the science, but at least it's encouraging that there are majorities in most of those countries that support the view of science and trust scientists. There will always be people who believe strange things. But of course, we've also entered a very strange period in our world history where the leaders of many countries, including some of our great democracies, have decided that lying blatantly, openly, without any consistency about science and many other things for their own ends is a perfectly legitimate political strategy. So that complicates matters quite a bit. However, the business of connecting and engaging with people still needs to go on, and scientists still need to do it. So I've got three things that I want to encourage us to do. The first thing I think that would be helpful would be if we were to reframe our idea of knowledge and just be honest about how we know things. Now, please don't get me wrong, I'm not backtracking on scientific knowledge, but the truth is that the reason I know that we've been to the moon is not because I witnessed it myself. Actually, I did watch it on television as a child, the first moon landing, but I wasn't there. I can't vouch for the fact that it wasn't faked. The reason I believe it is because I believe in a community of people made up of lots and lots of individuals, each of whom knows stuff that I believe that I can rely upon. And I'm saying this not to undermine our ideas of knowledge, but simply to be honest and open about it, because it engenders a certain kind of humility that enables us to talk with other people about, yes, of course, knowing something is not as straightforward as it appears, and it's a very good starting point for a discussion. The second thing I want to say is that, of course, FENS as an organisation does a huge amount in terms of outreach and public engagement. And that's a wonderful thing. And we should do everything we can to encourage organisations and individuals to do what they can to engage with the public. Now, this is a big ask because people are very busy and it's a demanding thing to do. But beyond that, that's an obvious thing for me to say. Beyond that, what I want to encourage us all to do is to engage with people with kindness and with empathy, because we discover that most everybody wants to know what's going on. If you talk to a flat earther or somebody that believes that the moon landings were faked, what they are attracted by is the desire to know for sure what is really happening. So you may say, well, they're open to kind of wacko ideas. Well, okay, maybe they've become part of a community that doesn't filter its evidence very well, doesn't know how to weigh up its evidence. But isn't that really the point? The difference between us is how we go about finding out what is true and what isn't. It's not that we don't care about the truth. And so to tell people that they're stupid or they're foolish or they're idiots for believing this or thinking that is extremely counterproductive. They've had enough of that and they're striking out on their own. And it's extraordinary to think that one of the places where we come together is simply in our shared humanity, mutual, encouraging mutual respect and a mutual desire to know what is going on. And the last thing I want to say won't be a big surprise to you, because I'm a public communication skills trainer. That's one of the things that I do. And I'm going to say that developing the skills in our organizations and as individuals to help us engage with people is very important. We are in challenging times, but with skill, with kindness, with some forbearance and some honesty about what we know, what we don't know, and how we know things. will take us a very long way. Happy engagement, everybody. Thank you.